Okay, do you want to start with the award?
Well, no, I was going to I was going to say just a little something about Helene Suedam's passing. The Suedams were longtime supporters of the society, and not only eminent scientists, but citizens who cared about and knew preemptive, who presciently knew about the importance of Los Alamos to the world. And their donation of what we've come to call the Oppenheimer House is something that the society takes very seriously. And her passing means that there's no longer an occupant there, and the society is indeed has been turned over the responsibility for the house. We are pleased to be in that position, and look forward to taking over and maintaining and protecting and accessing the Oppenheimer House. I wanted to thank John Ruminer for his stewardship over the past several years, both in terms of Helene and the Historic Properties Committee. He and my wife, I and my wife had a great honor of being escorted with John and Liz over to the house and meeting Helene a year ago when I became president of the Historical Society. And I was introduced as Roger Waterman, the new president of the Historical Society. And Helene said, "I think I have a pick with Roger Waterman, but I can't remember what it was." So we take this seriously, and we regret Helene's passing. But at 100 years old, who can complain? What a wonderful life. And with that, I'd like to go to another honor I've never done before, is present our History Award. And this award is only given once annually. It's only been done for 15 years or so. So there's only 15 of these medals out there and they've been given to 15 very unique individuals. But I'd like to read what the History Society Award means. The Los Alamos History Award is an annual award that recognizes someone who has made a significant contribution to preserving the world-changing history of our community. Factors that weigh heavily in consideration for the award include depth and breadth of achievement over time, volunteer commitment, and a lasting impact. Both individuals and organizations are eligible. Posthumous awards are not made, and self-nominations are not allowed. The winner is selected by the board of directors of the Los Alamos Historical Society. Therefore, the staff and board members are not eligible during periods of their active service. And with that, it is a proud and glorious honor to present the 2020 Los Alamos History Award to J. Arthur Freed. And I don't know Art well, but there's several board members that do, and I'm going to show, if I can see it. Can you see that? That's the award. That is the award, and there's only one of these. J. Arthur Freed. And Art, I hope you're online. but I'd like to ask a couple of your friends to say a couple of words about how important you've been to the Historical Society, to the cultural history of Los Alamos, and to the art history of Los Alamos. You have been a contributor extraordinaire, and there's if we've anybody who's missed it, they've missed a lot. Ron, this is Ron Wilkins, former president of the Historical Society, and he wanted to say hello, Art.
Hi, Art. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Art, I got to know Art during his service on the board. He served on the board from 2009 to 2016. And prior to that, he was the nominating chair, the nominating chair has the job of recruiting board members and coming up with a slate of officers. When a vacancy arose on the board, we all thought so highly of Art, we decided to appoint him to fill that vacancy, and he served from that time on until 2016. Now, in his professional life, Art was head of the Atlanta Library for many years, and so it was natural to ask Art to head the Archives and Collections Board Committee. In that position, he was instrumental in developing processes and procedures for the archives and in overseeing the move into the new Muni building. More recently, Art, who has been a member of the Oppenheimer Committee since 1972, worked to arrange the loan of the Oppenheimer bust that is now in the museum and the J. Robert Oppenheimer photo exhibit from the Oppenheimer Committee to the Society. So Art, thank you for all you've done, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ron. Well done. And Hetty Dunn was head of the Historical Museum for many years, and in fact was probably the single person most instrumental in preserving what we have in our archives and our collections. Hetty knew Art very well. And Hetty, would you like to say something?
I don't know if she's.
Okay, Mary Pat's on, and Mary Pat was head of the library system in Los Alamos for many years, and so knew Art very well. Mary Pat, would you like to add something to Art's history?
Well, Ron did a very good job and stole some of my thunder, but I do have a few things that I can add. To me, there are three categories that seem to fit Art. First of all, he recognized the value of our history. He worked hard to preserve that history. And in fact, he's become a part of that history. He recognized the value of the history when he made the decision to come with the love of his life, Nancy, to work at the laboratory, research library. And that in itself speaks to his appreciation for what Los Alamos is, who Los Alamos is, and the contributions I think that Los Alamos has made. His service on the Historical Society board showed that he values the preservation and conservation of that history as represented through the artifacts and documents that record that history. He was particularly influential in working with the improved standards of preservation and conservation, and found that the staff was very, very willing to work toward those ends, and he complemented their work very well. He was also appreciative of the fact that once you have your history, you conserve and preserve it, you have to protect it. And art worked very hard in that arena to improve the security of the collections, to provide secure access to the collection, and make sure that what everyone had worked so hard to create and preserve was protected. And now he's become a part of our history. He's one of our Los Alamos living treasures, having contributed to the community in many ways, not just to his work with preserving history. And so we, I think, honor him as a part of the history, as well as someone who appreciates it. So on a personal level, I've known Art for so many years, personally and professionally. He's a gentleman and a scholar, and he has a great sense of humor. So thank you, Art.
Yay.
Yay. Bart, thank you. Thank you for all you've done. And Liz and I will deliver this one-of-a-kind medal to you tomorrow, if you're available.
Roger and
Thank
Liz.
you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Roger and Liz.
Yes.
Sorry, I couldn't answer you because I was not able to unmute myself, but here I am. And I will be brief because I know, or I think I know, there might be another person wanting to have prepared remarks. I just wanted to add that it was just astonishing to me, and I think I wrote this to a couple of people on the board, that how many arts and cultural organizations Art supported over the time. And it wasn't just in Los Alamos. I'd see his name pop up in Santa Fe. We'd go to the smallest venue to the largest, and he'd be there right amongst the most generous donors. And it came from the heart, and it came from a kind of a position of knowing that he wanted to make life, the quality of life for everyone in northern New Mexico, that much better. And not only for us, but for our succeeding generations. And I just think that should be mentioned because we were the lucky recipients too of his generosity, but it was spread far and wide and with a very generous heart. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Eddie. I appreciate that, and so does Art.
Thank you, Hetty.
Back to you, Liz.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. We are really excited. This is our first lecture of the season. And originally, we were going to meet Nancy at our gala and have a great time together. And then she was going to stay for the lecture. But as you all know, that didn't happen. But we're so happy she's willing to join us virtually. And that's one reason the time was moved up a little bit to 6 o'clock, because many of our lectures are on the East Coast and it's just a little bit easier time slot for them. So I want to just do a quick introduction. Nancy Thorndike Greenspan was a health economist, and in the 1980s began a writing career as the co-author of 4 books with her husband, the late child psychiatrist Stanley Greenspan. She's the author of 2 biographies, The End of the Certain World, The Life and Science of Max Born, and the recently published Atomic Spy, The Dark Lives of Klaus Fuchs. She has served on the boards of numerous environmental organizations and committees and boards of the American Institute of Physics. She's an ice dancer, who knew? And she spends her free time at the rink. Nancy Greenspan lives in Bethesda, Maryland. And we're so happy to have Nancy joining us today. Let me stop sharing my screen and let her take over.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm sorry I'm not there and we aren't together. I was really looking forward to being there and meeting everyone, and next year we'll do that. I will see if I can, here we go.
We're gonna say next year at the Oppenheimer House.
Yes. Oops. There we go.
Oh,
All
let me
right,
just say
well-
one more thing. One more thing before we get started is if you have a question for Nancy, there is a button kind of on the bottom of your screen. Hopefully there's a little chat button. If you type your question in there, I'll read some of those questions out to Nancy at the end. So thank you.
And I'll be glad to answer whatever anyone wants to ask. And so I will start by summing up Klaus Fuchs, who was a man of mystery and complexity. He was German by birth, British by naturalization, and a communist by conviction. As a teenager in the 1920s, his passion was mathematics, and he didn't talk about politics at all. By the 1933, he was a 21-year-old firebrand who wanted to kill. And by 1945, he had aided 3 countries, the US, the UK, and the USSR, in developing atomic bombs. Many accounts mythologize Fuchs as an isolated, frail, reserved, lonely individual. This characterization has skewed our image of him. One piece of that is true. He was a very reserved person, but that was not what defined him as a person. What defined him as a person was his steely determination for social, political, and economic equality. Fuchs lived in a chaotic time. If he had lived in a different one, he probably would have had a life of an esteemed professor at a renowned German university, a quiet, reserved, non-political professor and scholar. And in the 1950s, he became sufficiently infamous that even now someone asked me, was he evil? So how does one consider a person who risked his life to fight the Nazis and then spied against his adopted country? Maybe the real question is, how does one weigh the factors in determining moral accountability? Fuchs left very little behind about himself. I located a half dozen overlooked archives that filled in gaps. Some files at the University of Kiel were simply labeled miscellaneous disciplinary matters, no connection to Fuchs on the labels, and probably hadn't been looked at in 85 years when I found them. But they laid bare his early drama. These documents and others about historically obscured moment in the 1940s give a more nuanced account of his life, as well as an appreciation for an unraveling world at that time. His story takes us to a different place, but somewhat familiar to us at this moment. Swept into Fuchs's story are international struggles, conflicts over immigration and race, establishment of internment camps, dysfunctional legislatures, street protests, paramilitary troops, Russian spying, and nuclear weapons. I cover all those topics extensively in my book, and I will touch on a few of them here to give you an overview of his life. He was born on December 29th of 1911 in a small town named Rüsselsheim. It's just south of Frankfurt. He was the third of 4 children whose early years were formed by the devastation of World War I and the aftermath. In 1918, there was the Allies' blockade, which resulted in tremendous starvation in the country. There was the Versailles Treaty and the onerous conditions that were placed on Germany. There was exorbitant inflation. Then there was the Great Depression and all of that unemployment. Here is Klaus, and he's the one in the army suit. And he and his brother Gerhard, who's next to him, have dug trenches and put their soldiers in there. Father Emil Fuchs was a liberal minister in a very conservative Lutheran church. Early on, he championed the welfare of the working class. He from the pulpit in articles and letters to the newspapers, He argued for the rights of the working class, and he condemned the right-wing militia that were starting to poison 1920s Germany. He was a socialist, not a communist. His views and personality had a profound effect on Klaus and his siblings. They all became socialists. Klaus and he were opposite in temperament. Klaus was as reserved as Emma was outspoken, but they both had in their core an unbending will that propelled them forward at all times. As a teenager, though, Klaus did not get involved in politics. He was a scholar in the family. He was famous in the area for his mathematical gifts, and he won the Weimar Republic's prize in the city for being the best student there. And there he is with his family. He's on the right with his mother in the middle and his siblings. In 1930, he registered at the University of Leipzig to study mathematics. Now, 1930s Germany was as unstable politically as it was economically. The president, Hindenburg, ruled by executive decree. The legislature, the Reichstag, frequent elections failed to create a ruling majority in that body, basically because the socialists and the communists had a long-standing hatred for each other. They barely spoke to each other. The presidential elections of 1932 saw conservative Hindenburg running for his second term, and the socialists, rather than nominating their own candidate, decided to support him so that they wouldn't split a vote and let another candidate win because of the split vote, and that other candidate was Adolf Hitler. This was one of the key turning points in Klaus's life. Every day for 2 years, Klaus and his older brother Gerhard had fought the policies of Hindenburg. It had started at the University of Leipzig, where Gerhard was a law student when Klaus arrived there. Gerhard was already an active member in the Student Socialist Society, and Klaus, that was one of his very first political moves, was to join as well. He was soon fighting Nazis in the street, and he later said that he learned more in the streets than he did in the classroom. And that's saying something, because one of his professors in physics there was Werner Heisenberg. After he finished his first year in Leipzig, he and Gerhard transferred to the University of Kiel. In the late 1920s, the Nazis I'm sorry, wait a minute. They had able to gain a strong grip on the universities in all over the country. Klaus and Gerhard, when they arrived there, registered in the Socialist Party, and looking around, they realized something had to be done, and they formed their own leftist student group to counter the Nazis. Gerhard, who was an outspoken activist like his father, was the leader, and Klaus was the political organizer, very much under the wing of Gerhard and under his influence. He was still a novice at it. He'd only been working in the political field for a year. And this is their group. So in Kiel, not being able to support Hindenburg, Klaus and Gerhard turned to the communist candidate. The socialists immediately kicked him out. The communists invited them in. The two of them hesitated, but they both joined up, and they never looked back, because it was at that point when the country started falling apart with mobs in the streets, shootings here and there, finally riots with stormtroopers rushing in. Klaus's hatred for the Nazis increased, and vice versa, until a secret Nazi student council sentenced him to death. It culminated in early February 1933, just after Hindenburg had appointed Hitler as chancellor, which it was an act that emboldened Nazis throughout the country, especially the students. When a riot erupted at the university, the stormtroopers rushed in and beat Klaus. The Nazi students yelled, "Throw him in the fjord." Police stood by and watched. How Klaus survived the frigid February inlet of the Baltic Sea is a mystery. The only thing he said was that he swam out. A few weeks later, by coincidence, he was traveling to Berlin in the early hours of the morning, and he saw in the newspaper that the Reichstag had burned. He knew when he arrived that it would be a very dangerous situation, and he immediately joined the underground network of young resistors. The average lifespan of these young resistors, who were mostly 20-year-old college students, was about 3 months before the Gestapo grabbed them and tortured them. By July of 33, the Gestapo were closing in on Klaus. The Gestapo in Kiel had told the Berlin branch that Klaus was the #1 student on their list and they had been looking for him. So he fled to Paris, and by September was at the University of Bristol. He was 21 years old at this point. His university years in Berlin gained him a BA and a PhD in physics. The Bristol did not have a math concentration for him at that time. And then after that, he received a postdoctoral fellowship to the University of Edinburgh in 1937. At both places, he was open about his communist ideology. But he did keep secret a part of this, in that he was keeping in contact with other German communist friends who had emigrated to London. And they were all working to help the resistors in Germany. They were printing propaganda material and shipping it to them. And Klaus's hatred of the Nazis just kept increasing, because at this point, he was aware of the suffering that his family had undergone. His brother Gerhard had escaped just barely to Prague and contracted TB and was in a sanatorium. His sister Elizabeth committed suicide by jumping out of a train, their mother had committed suicide in a different way a few years before. His younger sister Crystal had obtained a visa to the US. She was the only one that made it out safely, and she was going to the to the Swarthmore College. Only 67-year-old Emil Fuchs was left in Berlin, and he took care of this little boy here, Elizabeth's child, his grandson, throughout the war. In September of 1939, World War II started with basically a phony war. The real war didn't begin until the spring of 1940. And it was at this time that the British government worried about refugees, who they knew were mostly Jewish, but they thought they might become a fifth column and aid a German invasion. So it ordered the refugees to be rounded up and interned. Excusing this absurdity, one cabinet official said, quote, "Once a German, always a German." So on May 12th of 1940, Klaus became one of the first of 30,000 to be interned. Those who at that time were herded into camps surrounded by barbed wire with armed guards, such as this one where he was, with little food, no newspapers, mail, crammed space. They did have Nazi POWs with them who taunted them mercilessly, and the guards did nothing. Basically, they had isolation, starvation, and sadistic guards. One internee described them as, quote, caged animals. On July 3rd, the British government shipped Klaus to Canada. As he was about to leave, he wrote a letter to his mentor in the University of Edinburgh, Max Born, saying, quote, "I find it hard to cut away from a country which I have learned to love." The 10-day trip across the Atlantic to Quebec City was horrific. The internees lived through starvation and bouts of severe vomiting and diarrhea with no access to a bathroom at night. No one escaped the stench, filth, and squalor of the boat. It was awful. They arrived in Quebec, and then they stood on the deck of the ship in a searing sun for 10 hours with little water until they didn't get it till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and no food. And finally at 7 p.m., they were bussed up to the Plains of Abraham and Camp L with their barbed wire and guards. The cliques formed there. And the leader of the communist clique was Hans Kahler, a very charismatic soldier, had been a friend of Hemingway's during the Civil War, and here they are walking during the war. Fuchs became his deputy, and I saw it basically as a similar relationship to the one he had with his brother in Kiel and Berlin when they were in the underground. Kahler and Fuchs were very clever, and they skillfully organized a broad refugee committee so that when the Canadian government had to move Camp L, they decided to split it up and create a kosher camp for the Orthodox Jews. Klaus at that point had enough influence to manipulate the numbers so that the non-Jewish communists could go there to the kosher camp. The non-Jewish communists feared that the brutality, if they could put into a camp of Nazi POWs, it would have been very, very difficult for them. And that is, it was an old, terrible dirty train depot that they got put into, which was Camp N. After release from internment and back in England in January of 1941, Fuchs received an offer to work at the University of Birmingham on the British atomic bomb project. And once there, he visited with the communists he had met in the camp. Birmingham is a big city, so there were many refugees and immigrants who were there. But included in that was Hans Kahler, who was a recruiter for the Russian military intelligence. Now, it's unlikely that Klaus knew that at the time that they were in the camps, but he certainly learned it later on. So it's not, given that, it's not surprising to know that in August of 41, Fuchs met a Russian agent in London, which was his first step into espionage that sealed his fate later on. Internment alone did not create Klaus Fuchs the spy, but it did reawaken Klaus Fuchs the resistor and the communist. It renewed his voice that he had lost as a student. In December of 1943, he sailed to New York City with a British scientific team to work on the Manhattan Project. He had a new handler there he met fleetingly throughout the city. And then came a transfer to Los Alamos in 1944, July, where he was responsible for the theoretical work on the lenses for the plutonium bomb. He had a few other responsibilities too, but when he first got there, that's what he focused on. And there were many key points in creating the bomb, but that was one of them, because there were problems with how these lenses fit together, and he figured out a problem with jets. On June 2nd of 1945, he drove to the security gate at Los Alamos. Guards checked his car. He got in, he drove down to the outskirts of Santa Fe and gave the plutonium bomb plans to the handler from New York who had come to meet him there. During the car search, these plans had been in his jacket pocket. A month later, there was a Trinity test for the plutonium bomb that was successful. And then came Hiroshima and Nagasaki just 75 years ago. US and UK scientists foresaw an arms race. And to thwart it, many of them urged the government to share information with the Russians and then to institute a very strict inspection regimen. And basically, over time, those two governments said no. Fuchs returned to England in the summer of 1946, where he was appointed head of the theoretical division at the British nuclear top secret facility at Harwell, which is near Oxford. They had gas rationing at this time, and a lot of their social life, which you can see was this picnic. They had parties. For 3 years, they all lived very close together there. And then there was another life-changing event. In August of 1949, the US and the UK codebreakers in Arlington, Virginia, just down the road from where I live, deciphered some early 1940 Russian messages, a project later called Venona. They contained evidence of a spy in the Manhattan Project. And really within a few weeks, they had pinpointed Klaus as a probable person. Without these messages, it was unlikely that it ever would have been discovered. So then a game of cat and mouse ensued between Fuchs and MI5. It began with MI5 following his every move, bugging his phones, bugging his apartment and his office. They needed to catch him handing over documents because they didn't want to reveal that they had the Venona project in court. They didn't want the Russians to know they had, deciphered these messages because it was so secret. So they had to catch him in the act, but he had stopped spying months earlier, so they did not do so. Mystery, at least in my mind, surrounds his decision to stop spying much earlier on. Before MI5 and the FBI even knew there was an inkling it was a spy, Fuchs, this was April, say, of 1949, Fuchs thought he might be in trouble and might be found out. So when MI5 started tailing him around England in September, he quickly spotted them. Basically, he was the cat, not the mouse. He knew exactly what they were doing. So they then they decided they had to interview him to see if they could break him down. And they sent in their top interviewer, who was Jim Scardon at MI5, and he couldn't trip Fuchs up. Fuchs just denied everything for the most part. But finally, at the end of January 1950, Fuchs confessed, own volition, because he struggled with having betrayed his friends and subjecting them. If he didn't confess, they would be subjected to submission and they would be questioned, and he wouldn't let that happen. He decided he had to be honorable and protect them. So he was arrested. A month later, on March the 1st, he pled guilty in the Old Bailey. It was a trial that lasted 88 minutes, and it was a media sensation. The judge gave him the max, 14 years for espionage. He was a bit shocked. He had believed and been told that if he cooperated, he'd be given a light sentence. He could have appealed because there were irregularities with his interview, but he chose not to, that he did what he did and he was willing to take his punishment. And so that was it. For the Americans and British throughout this time, there was a sober backdrop to the hunt. In August of 1949, the Russians had detonated a plutonium bomb. Fuchs's information had moved up their own time schedule 1 to 2 years. No scientists in the UK or the US doubted whether the Russians would actually get a nuclear bomb once they knew there could be one, but they didn't expect it to be so quickly, and they were stunned by it. Everyone was shocked. Well, Fuchs was in prison. He continued to answer MI5 questions. He continued to cooperate, especially on his 4 handlers that he had. Although by the time he remembered details about them, the persons in question had left the country, so nobody was arrested because of it. 2 people he didn't give up were his last handler in London and his American contact. He gave a vague description to the FBI of this person in the US. The FBI is under tremendous pressure from J. Edgar Hoover to find this go-between. Behind closed doors, Hoover was being pressed by Congress. Why didn't the FBI detect the spying? Hoover blamed MI5, and with some reason. In 1934, MI5 security file on Fuchs had evidence of his communist ties in Germany. They never told the Americans. And every time there was a security clearance, which was half a dozen times, this was discussed, but it was decided they would keep letting him do his research. Even though they didn't tell the Americans, they assured them that they had done a rigorous security clearance on all the British scientists who came over. At the same time, MI5 told a British government official not to reveal Fuchs's communist background to the Americans. And so up until the time when Klaus was arrested, they knew nothing about it. He was in several prisons. So this was the first one, and always held in high esteem by other inmates. He listened to their problems. He gave them cigarettes. He himself was a chain smoker. He initiated courses in math and physics. Many of the men who then came out later were able to use that in order to get jobs. He was paroled in 9 years for good behavior. The British tried to persuade him to stay and work with them, and he refused. On June the 24th, 1959, he boarded a Polish airliner at Heathrow. He landed in East Berlin with no hero's welcome. His nephew, Klaus, who was raised by his father, names get confusing here. There was a nephew, Klaus, and he was Emil's grandson who Emil raised him, met him along with an East German government official. Of course, there were hordes of journalists, as had been in London. A limousine met them. It was driven by a Stasi agent, it turned out, but they wouldn't have known it at the time, and took them to Emil's cottage, his summer cottage. By September, Klaus was the deputy director of the nuclear research facility in Dresden. He had a nice apartment in the city and a weekend home nearby, and he had married Greta Carlson, a woman he had met in Paris in 1933, and the woman who had met him at the airport with the nephew Klaus. And there are the three generations of Fuchses and Klaus with Greta. The Russians wanted Klaus to come work with them on weapons research in their facility in Dubna. He refused that. His dream, and had been his dream since he was in Harwell, was to create a special commercial reactor. In this case, he wanted to use it to power the East German economy. And the East German government had told him that he could do this research, but after a few years, they abandoned him and his research. And he was devastated. He had waited many years to get this done. He really felt that he could contribute something, and it just broke him completely. In his later years, he called for a nuclear disarmament. So the man who had been key in creating bombs for 3 countries became a peacenik, or maybe he always had been. It kind of ran in the family, just as his father had become a Quaker when he was also a Lutheran minister. Klaus's short-term goals were to create a bomb for the Allies ahead of the Nazis, but once that was put in place, he felt he needed to then protect the Russian government against the imperialist, capitalist nuclear blackmail that could have befallen them. Fuchs maintained that his goal with spying was to create a nuclear balance and obviate the bomb's further use. Klaus died in 1988, January. He was 76. He died of lung cancer. He was buried in a Berlin cemetery. It was for noted communists, and had a formal funeral with procession and a string quartet. The Russians had never admitted that he had helped them. On this occasion, they did acknowledge him, and they sent a lovely wreath, as part of the funeral. And along with it, they also sent a representative, a young KGB agent from Dresden by the name of Vladimir Putin. The significance of Fuchs's spying for military purposes is unclear. The Russians' advance in schedule meant that they had a bomb at the time that we entered the Korean War. Or when we started it or came into it. There were many factors involved in Truman's decision not to drop a bomb, which most people consider a good thing. And the Russians having one certainly played a part. How big a part is still being debated. But there was a political downside, and that is indisputable. Anglo-American cooperation on nuclear cooperation stopped. Americans succumbed to a Red Scare hysteria with Senator Joseph McCarthy. American civil liberties suffered, and Cold War heated up. So Fuchs, the quiet, serious student of mathematics, faced perils, took life-threatening risks, and made grave choices. How do we judge him? The question of moral accountability is not new. It is still with us and as difficult to resolve. Now we debate the standing of some of our most significant founders of our country. In our own chaotic world, ambiguity prevails. If a deeper understanding of these issues, which many are still with us, interests you, please consider reading Atomic Spy and telling your friends about it. You can also go to atomicspythebook.com. I have a video page there with 4 videos of background to old ones from the 30s and 40s, background on Klaus's life, and one of those actually has him in it, a very short one. And I thank you very much for your attention and for attending. And I'm glad to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Nancy. There's a chat box at the bottom if you have any questions for Nancy. We do have her book in our museum shop, which is open Monday through Friday. We're open now from 10 to 2, but you can also order it online in the museum shop if you are interested in reading more from Nancy. Let's see. There was a little discussion here about whose car that may have been, Feynman's car or Fuchs' car.
It was Fuchs. He lent that car to Feynman so Feynman could go visit his wife in the sanatorium. The Piles had gotten him, he spent about $50 on this Buick. It was a real junk heap. They all had cheap ones like that. Not all of them. A few people had cheap ones like that. And it was his.
Any other questions? Any other questions? I know we have people in this group right here who do some of our spy tours for the history museums, and now is your opportunity to ask each other some questions. It's not Stump Nancy, but we have a lot of good minds here. So if you have any thoughts or questions on the topic, chat below.
Well, you had told me there was one in the
There is. Someone online had typed in a question, and that was, why wasn't he, how did he get away with it? Why didn't they discover he was a spy when he was here? Like, why did it take
so long?
some time?
Question. I think one of the reasons is he had most of the time he was working 20 hours a day at Los Alamos. There were only a couple of times when he actually handed off material. And he knew enough about the system to plan it so that it wasn't suspicious. There were days off that people could go to Santa Fe. One time he had offered to buy the liquor for the British party as they were about to leave in September after, all the bombs had gone off. And so he went down to buy the liquor, but as he was buying the liquor, he also met his contact.
That would be like 75 years this week, right? I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wasn't
Yes.
the mission trip, the British party,
Yes.
like this week or next week?
It was a Saturday, like the 15th or 16th. It was
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, right now.
Okay. I know. So here's a question. Who were his contacts while he was here in Los Alamos?
His
Contacts were not in Los Alamos, probably, right?
well, in Los Alamos, he had no spy contacts. He was very close friends with Rudy Piles. He had lived at the Piles house in Birmingham. That's who had hired him to be in Birmingham. Rudy had wanted him to be in the British team, to be in New York. And once in New York, Rudy and Hans Bethe both wanted Fuchs to come out and do the mathematical work for them because he was amazing at it. And people kind of talk about him as being a mathematical computer, that's all he did was just generate numbers. I think he gets shortchanged that way. he and Feynman put together a patent on the hydrogen bomb, and he himself has said that he did most of the work on it. I'm sorry, it wasn't Feynman, it was von Neumann. Von Neumann was no slouch. He was probably one of the best mathematicians of the 20th century. And Klaus was, you know, I mean, may not have been his equal, but he was very, very, very good. And he was he was working on theoretical work. He wasn't just doing mathematics. And so he was very good friends with Feynman. They lived next door to each other, and they used to pal around. He would spend a lot of time with the Piles. He babysat for Edward Teller's son. He was good friends with Edward Teller's wife. So he was a quiet person, but he did have plenty of friends in Los Alamos, and people respected him for what he did.
Do you know about what his relationship was to Oppenheimer?
You know, I don't know that much. They certainly knew each other. As I discuss in the book, all of these people who are at Los Alamos had a common person they all knew. And I know about this because it was Max Born, and I wrote his biography. Oppenheimer got his PhD from Born in Germany. Teller had been his assistant. Fuchs was with him in Edinburgh. But Hans Bethe and he had a scholarly
web.
So they all knew each other, and they had that common ingredient. So I don't think it was a close relationship. I think Oppenheimer was busy, but he certainly knew who Fuchs was and what Fuchs could do, and was pleased to have him there.
Did he make handwritten copies of the documents that he turned over, or did he take actual documents? Do you know?
From what I can understand, he actually had copies, and I guess he would have had to do them by hand.
No copy machines, right?
The first batch, he actually sat in the library to make sure he had all of the measurements and everything that he could get precise. I mean, it had to be right. He couldn't be off by a few inches or a nano inch here or there. And for the second one, on one of them, he said he stopped on the way going down to write out the information. Harry Gold was the person. When he met with his sister, when he was staying with his sister and met Harry Gold in Philadelphia, his sister Crystal had gone to Swarthmore. There, he didn't have anything with him. He just did it all out of his head. He had an amazing memory, and he could start to do things from first principles too. You know, you just start off, oh yeah, it has to be this, and he could continue on his own. He didn't need that much.
Where did you do most of your research?
You know, I think I probably was hit about 50 different archives. For biography on Max Born, I hit about 100, but I didn't go to all of them. The ones that I found, the most time I spent was at the National Archives in London, because MI5 had declassified thousands of pages, not only on Fuchs, but on everybody who was connected during that time who had a security file. But and so that was really important. You couldn't write the book without it. But the University of Kiel had these wonderful material with what Fuchs did to fight the Nazis there. And nobody had ever found these before. So I spent a lot of time in, well, the archives is not in Kiel. It's in the sweet little town up towards Denmark, which I love to go to. Interesting places like the Holocaust Museum has 10 boxes of Fuchs letters of the family. There was a school had been in Germany that moved because of the Nazis, moved to Switzerland. And I found archives there with the family because Gerhard and Crystal had both gone there. Klaus used to go to visit, and there were lots of family letters and going back and forth. So that's where I spent my time mostly. I mean, it really was in London. There was a lot, but I went to Bristol. You know, nice thing about when you do a biography, you get to go to all the places where, and interesting places.
Well, we're all dreaming of going to places right now, so.
I'm glad I got to go when I went.
I'm glad you got to go before all of this lockdown occurred. There's a question. Did Perils have any communist sympathies?
You know, Piles, many of the German physicists who came over were more on the left, but I don't think they were socialists. The Social Democrats, I mean, I just called them socialists because you start getting into all these different labels and it's hard to follow. The Social Democrats in Germany were the party that had the plurality before the Nazis, you know, made their rise. So many people in Germany were Social Democrats. They were socialists who wanted a more equal country. They wanted to do it through a parliamentary procedure. That's what Emil Fuchs wanted also. They didn't want to do it by revolution, which is the difference with communists. Basically, they both kind of want an equal society. I mean, that's the philosophy, and it's how you get there that's the issue. And that was one of the reasons why the communists and socialists in Germany didn't speak and had broken apart. They'd both been together and broken apart, and it was not able to put it back together. So I don't think that Piles had any communist sympathies, but he was liberal, progressive, you know, as were many of the other ones who came over.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really interesting to hear the backstory of, you know, it's much deeper than just one thing that happened. There's so much depth to it. So to me, it's really interesting, the whole story. So thank you again for your presentation. And if anyone's interested in the book, stop by the museum shop. You can also order it online from the museum shop, and Todd will hand deliver it to you if you live in Los Alamos. You get a hand delivery. Otherwise, would have to mail it to you. But we appreciate everyone being here. And another congratulations to Art Fried. I see him I see him. So yay to Art Fried. We're so thankful for everything you've done for our town and the Historical Society. So any other questions before we leave? I guess I can tell you that the next lecture will be October 13th. And this one was actually scheduled in April and then it's been moved, but he will also be online, and it's Matthew Schindel, if people are interested in that one. And then on November 17th will be The Best Kept Secret of the War, The Successes and Failures of the Manhattan Project Secrecy. So that's Alex Wellerstein. And both of those will be also earlier at 6 o'clock. So I know it's a different time. So hopefully get your supper and join us for a lecture in the supper. That would be nice. You're getting a lot of thank yous. Thank you for your interest in the lecture.
Can I say something?
Sure. Who is this?
Well, obviously.
Oh, Art. Yes, Art.
Well, I thought I should at least thank the society, its board, and its officers, and the staff. The society is a very welcoming and generous organization, which is probably a major reason for it being, as I understand it, although we are a small town, it is the largest county historical society in the state of New Mexico. I'm not too surprised. I wasn't too surprised when I heard of that, but it is an interesting fact, seems to me. And generosity is demonstrated by this medal coming, or this award coming to me. I'm very appreciative. Thank you.
We miss you, Art. Art, I remember when we had lectures actually in Fuller Lodge, Art was there every single time. So
I did what?
we miss seeing you at the lectures in person, Art. I remember you were there every time.
Oh, I probably was.
Someone's asking Bob Godwin to say something. I don't know if I can unmute him or not, but okay, it says, it's amazing, but the scientists at Los Alamos documented their work in the form of polished scientific journal articles. I had the chance to read several Fuchs documents. They were beautifully written explanations of the science. His work was highly respected and understandably so. I believe Hans Bethe, the leader of the theory division, considered the Fuchs one of the outstanding theoreticians. He clearly worked hard for the US with no hint of any sabotage in his work. So that's an interesting comment.
Yes, it is. And it's accurate.
Yeah. All right. I think the discussion on spying will continue. So it's always a fun topic. It's always interesting to think about. Thank you again, Nancy, for your
thank you.
lecture. And we hope to see you in person one of these days.
Yes.
One day
Promise.
we'll have a gala and we're all going to celebrate. So
I promise. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. See you next month.
Night. Bye-bye.